Okay, welcome here to week 4. We're now into activity-based costing. This week 4, we're going to look at Chapter 18, also known as Chapter 4. This activity-based costing is all about factory overhead. Up till this point so far, we've been allocating factory overhead based on usually just one item, like direct labor. And that's the traditional way, the easy way about allocating factory overhead. However, there are some instances where it's better to allocate your factory overhead over different types of criteria, as you'll see in some of our examples, where if you just simply allocate factory overhead one way, you may not get a real good accurate cost of something's real value versus if you allocated the cost a little bit different between two or more products. So let's jump into this. All right, so our goal, I usually like to do this, is so we're, again, like I said, we're trying to find a better way to allocate factory overhead more than just on one thing. And so the first thing I wanted to do is show a little example of what we have previously been doing, and then look at how the difference is between difference with ABC, otherwise known as activity-based costing. Traditional based costing here. All right, so we made two different types of vacuums, a basic and an advanced type. And of the basic type, it's cheaper, therefore it's more common. More people are going to buy it, 1,000 units. Advanced only make 300 units. And the cost that I've given us, it costs about $30,000 of maybe a little bit cheaper materials, not as much materials, to make the 1,000 units, and $16,500 of the 300 units to make 300 units. We're going to assume, to make it pretty easy, that each item takes about 1 labor hour to assemble, to put together and make. So if we made 1,300 units, that's about 1,300 labor hours, and we're going to price it at $15 an hour. We pay our people. And our factory overhead was $80,000 for this month or whatever it is. And we have already determined, based on labor hours or machine rates, however, I based it on labor hours here, that it's for every labor hour we incur, we need to allocate for every labor hour we need to put $60 into the cost of that product. So if it takes 2 hours to make something, which obviously it doesn't, only takes 1, it would be 160 or 120. And we're going to spread that 80,000 out. All right, so let's look at how much total cost does it take to make a basic vacuum here. All right, so I told us it was $30,000 in direct materials. Spread that over 1,000 items, and that's $30 a piece. And then I told us it takes 1 hour of labor at $15, so that's $15 added into the total cost. And then since it was only 1 hour of labor, and I told us in our opening information, for every hour we put $60 for factory overhead. So our basic vacuum here costs us, with this allocation aspect here, $105. And then we did the same thing. The only cost difference was the direct materials. The materials are more, maybe better materials, maybe it has more materials, whatever it is. $55, add them all up, it's $130. So not a huge difference between the two, but enough. And then if I was to project it with a 25% markup, this would be my possible selling price. That's the whole purpose to get our cost here, is to find out how much do I need to sell these items for and still make a profit. Now, that's the traditional way. This right here was the traditional way. How do we allocate that 80,000? And we had decided here $60 no matter what, no matter which type we make. Well, now we think about it a little differently, and what we have to do in activity-based costing is determine how many different activities are there in making one of these vacuums. And for this one, I decided on there's four different areas to make it. We've got to first design it, assemble it. There are machine setup times where we need to have machine setups, and then all of the extra property and plant stuff like depreciation, taxes, those kind of items. And so I split up the costs. The whole $80,000 is just split up in these four different areas of making a vacuum. That's the first thing you have to do in activity-based. So as you can see right off, it's more work for the owners or whoever is making these reports, because they got to go through and allocate that $80,000 into each different setup that we want to have, each different area of making a vacuum. And then in step 2, we've got to take each one of these four activity-based and determine how much time was spent doing that, doing design. And we found there was about 100 hours in the basic, and it took us 400 hours in advanced. Advanced was more, it's a harder sweeper to make, or vacuum to make, so it took more design time, more engineer time to get the thing working the way it should have been working. So our design labor guys should have more costs go to them in the advanced because they worked more on that. It wouldn't be fair to split it up evenly. Assembly, well, we make a lot more basic, so we're going to have more people making the basic, more hours. So out of the 4,000 hours total, this is how we had them divided up. Setups, each time we have to change something, that's considered a machine setup. There were 500 changes for the entire month or year, whatever it is, and we split those up. And then property and plant, we're going to divide up all the expenses, the other type of items that go along with the property and plant, like utilities and property taxes, by square footage that these two vacuums make. So the basic requires 3,500 square feet, and the advanced to 2,500 out of the total 6,000. Then our third step is just simply combining these and saying, okay, designing. If it takes, what I need to do is get a cost per item. So if we have a total of $12,000 in designing, and we have a total of 500 hours in design labor, well, how much does it cost per hour? And what we simply come up with our simple division here is for every hour spent designing, $24 should be allocated for that factory overhead. And we do the same thing for each of these. Out of the $32,000 spent in assembling, there were 4,000 hours total devoted to assembling. So how much dollars per hour went to assemble? And for every hour that we assemble, $8 of overhead should go to that item. Setups, it was $48 per setup. And then property and plant, if we had $12,000 in expenses spread out over 6,000 feet, that's $2 per square foot. Now the final step then is just simply taking what we just did, our rates per hour per machine, and combining those with what actually happened. So for the basic, designed $24 an hour for 100 hours, $2,400, compared to $9,600 for the advanced. If we add up all the rest of these as you go through, so let's just look at one more here. $2,500 or 2,500 hours at $8 per hour, so that's $20,000 for the basic. We do that for the other two. That's a total factory overhead of $39,000. And then we add in the advanced, add up all these, it's $41. These two added together better be my total of $80,000 of factory overhead, and it is. Then I need to simply take this $39,000 that should have been allocated to the factory overhead, where, remember up here, it was basically even, it was $40,000 a piece. But what I need to do is take the $39,000 for the basic, divide that out by the 1,000 units that we make. So for every item we should be charged $39 for factory overhead. Compared to the other way, the traditional way where we just base it on machine out, on direct labor hours, no, excuse me, we break it on, yes, direct labor hours. We charged ourselves $60 for the basic, when really it only costs $39 if I allocate it more on an activity-based instead of just one traditional way. Whereas the advanced takes kind of a hit. Their rate went from $60 when really it costs about $137. And a lot of that comes from the design. It took a lot longer to design, and those guys are paid a lot more, like engineers. Therefore, more of the cost should go to the advanced. And that equates to $137 per machine or per item instead of just the $60, which makes a huge difference then in our total costs. So if I go back, these first two items are the same as was at the very beginning of our example. Direct materials stay the same, it's $30, $55. Labor stays the same. But now our factory overhead is split maybe more equally as it should be. Maybe, maybe not. That's just the decision you have to make as a manager. So now the basic really only cost me $84 to make instead of it was over $100 before. So then with our markup, I'm really only selling our item for $105 instead of the whatever it was, 150, I believe. No, 131 up here. So I can sell it at a cheaper amount because it really didn't cost me as much to make that. Whereas I'm going to really up my price of the advanced because before I was selling it probably too cheap for what it really cost me to make it. Okay, so a couple takeaway points here. The basic vacuum before, when we priced it at $130+ dollars, that might have been kind of over the top, and where other competitors were pricing it lower, we could have been pricing it lower and still made a profit based on the $84 cost. The advanced, like I said, wasn't priced high enough. So one last takeaway is typically the less you make of something, the more costs that are going to occur to help, because you don't have very much to spread it around. We didn't make very many items. We didn't make very many. We only made, 300 compared to 1,000. So we're spreading that 41,000, even though it's similar, it's about the same for basic and for advanced. We're spreading it over a lot less items, so therefore each item has to absorb more. And the other thing here is the more advanced something is, the more technical it requires, there's going to be it's going to be a higher cost because you're having more expensive labor, more expensive products, and you need to allocate those properly instead of just evenly across all items. Then the drawbacks here, of course, as I said, there's a lot more time put in. You have to go in and find out each different, first off, you have to determine what are your activity bases. Second, allocate your overall factory overhead into those factory bases. And then how much hours or time or labor was spent on each one. So it is a lot more involved, but it does give you a lot of times more accurate costing. If there are not much overhead costs, it really doesn't benefit you to use this. Whereas when should you use ABC costing? One of the things is, if you have a whole bunch of overhead costs, you don't have that much labor, and you don't have that much direct materials, that you have most of your cost is factory overhead, then you probably should spend the extra time to devote the costs accordingly. If your product lines differ a lot in volume, like ours did with the basic and the advanced, 1,000 versus 300, it might behoove you to go ahead and use the activity-based costing. And then if you ever have your, you look at your final net incomes or your gross profit and you see, hey, I'm selling a whole bunch of something here, but yet I'm still losing money. Am I really losing money on it? You may want to re-look at your costs to see if that's true. The last item on here, value added. This was just kind of a little separate piece of the chapter. It makes sense. It's things that you should know when we're looking at making items. Is the cost of making something a value-added cost or a non-value-added cost? And obviously, you want to avoid as much non-value as you can. Value-added cost, anything that really goes into making the product, that you got to design it. That's a cost that has to be there. You're going to have to put it together. You're going to have to package it. All those things you have to do. But things that you don't have to do, I mean, you still have to do them, but you want to get them down to as little as possible. Anything that basically does not make the product better or you don't need it to deliver. So things, costs that do not make the product better or needed to deliver to the customer, these items would be non-value. So anytime you have to set up a machine, you're not really making, that's not part of getting the product. It's, you hope to only set the machine up once, if at all practical. If you have to move something 5 times before it gets worked on, maybe it's a lot better if you only have to move it twice or 1 time. Of course, spec'ing, you're going to have to do it, but hopefully as less as possible. You don't like storing. You're spending money on stuff and then having to spend money to store it in somewhere as well. So you're spending money to acquire it, and then you're spending money to store it. That's not necessarily a good thing to have. So that's just a little bit on value versus non-value added activities. Okay, what I want to do now is we're gonna switch gears. I'm gonna look at the WileyPLUS. The WileyPLUS, I have some exercises that we would normally go through in class, but what I want to look at for our time here is a couple of the WileyPLUS calculations to help maybe make this a little easier to understand. We're going to look at Wiley 18-5 kind of in a brief, but what I wanted to draw your attention to is when you are, it tells you to round the intermediate calculations to 2 decimal places, but I found it very well could count you wrong if you do that. It's best to, when you have one of the long decimals, you're having to calculate a couple different numbers and one of them may be a longer decimal, leave it as it is and then multiply whatever that long number is by the number of products, like 20. And it'll give you a WileyPLUS will give you a kind of a range of about, they may fluctuate 10 cents, they'll give you a leeway, but if you're off by 25 cents, it may count it wrong. And that happened to me on one, and I'll show that in one of our WileyPLUS exercises.